Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled Balancing Housing Needs with Clean Water, brought to you by Grow Smart Rhode Island and the University of Rhode Island, NEMO. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program along with Peng Suti Sambat, SNP Network Project Manager with the New England Environmental Finance Center. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce the SNP Network. The SNP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through the management of stormwater and restoration projects. The SNP Network focuses on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNP region. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, snpnetwork.org. And before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. At the end of the webinar, there will be a Q&A session. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. Additionally, there is a chat feature in your Zoom control panel. We will be sharing links to resources during the webinar in the chat. We also have closed captions available for today's webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the closed captions feature in the Zoom control panel. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Scott, our Rhode Island SNP Network liaison. And I'll now hand things over to you, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you. Many thanks to Leah and her colleagues at the New England Environmental Finance Center and the University of Southern Maine's Media Services for hosting today's webinar. I also want to acknowledge assistance that we've received in planning this webinar that was provided by Jen West with the Narragansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. To set the stage for today's webinar, I just want to say that the housing crisis has been characterized by some as Rhode Island's top issue. As stated by House Speaker Joseph Shekarchi nearly 2 years ago, Rhode Island is facing a profound housing crisis. Our housing is not affordable, it's in short supply, and our housing stock is aging and often not in safe, livable conditions. And if, as stated by the former Secretary of Housing, the long-term solution to the housing crisis is to build more houses, where should we build those houses? This is clearly not a problem unique to Rhode Island. In fact, many states across the country have already enacted statewide laws to accommodate increased housing density, such as setting minimum lot size requirements, which in essence override local land use authority. Concerns have been raised to similar proposals being discussed here in Rhode Island, especially as it relates to the lack of infrastructure to support such development in more rural areas and the protection of sensitive water resources. In today's webinar, we are going to dive into the topic and discuss why density matters with respect to both surface water and groundwater quality, and how housing needs can be met without impacting the quality of the water that we depend upon for our drinking water, economic prosperity, and recreational pursuits. More specifically, our speakers will, next slide, please, discuss the unintended impacts to the state's water resources resulting from development, describe the state-adopted approaches to supporting growth and housing density while also protecting water resources, identify the reasons why municipal adoption of certain regulations to protect water and other natural resources is critical, describe the impacts of limiting municipal authority to implement smart growth techniques, and finally, identify where housing density is appropriate. Leading us in this discussion are two of Rhode Island's experts on smart growth and water quality protection, Scott Millar and Lorraine Joubert. Scott Millar is currently the Director of Conservation and Community Assistance for Grow Smart Rhode Island. He provides technical assistance and training to Rhode Island communities to encourage them to adopt smart growth land use techniques to accommodate growth that avoids impacts to natural resources and community character. And Lorraine Joubert is Director of the Nonpoint Education for Municipal Officials at the University of Rhode Island. Cooperative Extension. She provides training and technical assistance to local officials in protecting water quality while accommodating growth. Lorraine is a Rhode Island native with a degree in water resources management from URI. To start our session, before we get into our presenters, we have an introductory poll question for those participating, and we're going to put that on, put that up here shortly. And if you would please just respond so we understand what everyone's interests are in attending today. And here we have our results. So clearly the majority of folks today are attending the webinar because they are concerned about both housing and water quality and unintended impacts to our resources. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Scott Millar, who will open our speaker session.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. If the first slide could be brought up, please. While that's happening, just a quick disclaimer. Over the years, I've worked with a number of different agencies and organizations, including municipalities. What I'm presenting today is a combination of lessons learned by working with all these organizations and not necessarily representative of any of the, doesn't necessarily represent the opinions of any of the organizations that I've worked for in the past. So obviously the key here is balancing housing and clean water. If I get to the next, please. And it's very clear Rhode Islanders want clean water and affordable housing. Both are critical objectives to achieve. Clean water and open space bonds consistently receive the highest voter approval, rates at 80% or more. Approval rates for affordable housing are very close behind. Rhode Island needs to clearly balance housing and clean water. So let's just talk about some key objectives. Water quality is directly linked to land use. As we increase density, unfortunately, we begin to see a decrease in water quality. Polluted waters are very expensive and very time-consuming to restore, and often it's not possible to restore waters to their pristine condition. So the emphasis is clearly on trying to prevent new water quality contamination sources to the extent possible. And a key point here is that state regulations by themselves are not adequate to protect water quality. And that's not a function of the weakness of the regulations or the people that administer them. They're as good as they're going to get. The issue is that the state cannot control density, or it cannot control the type of use. Therefore, municipal land use is critical to supplement state regulations to protect water quality. And smart growth techniques can help balance housing and water quality by minimizing impervious cover and helping to guide development away from sensitive areas. And we're going to be talking about that more as we move forward. Next, please.
Thanks, Scott. So I'd like to discuss a little bit about what the stormwater problem is and what are the causes. And one of the problems is if we were in one of those natural areas, those DEM parks, rainwater would be infiltrating into the ground and seeping through and infiltrating to restore and replenish groundwater. But we live in environments that are completely, in many cases, almost completely covered with pavement, rooftops, other hard surfaces that prevent water from running into the ground, and instead it runs off. And as it runs off, it carries everything that's on the pavement: fertilizers, dog poop, chemicals, spills, and the oily ones are the visible ones. Most of the problems that are on the ground and washing in are not visible. And they, for the most part, go directly into storm drains and then into our bay, rivers, and streams. Now, since 1997, when the problem of impervious cover was first discovered by researchers in the Pacific Northwest trying to restore salmon to salmon runs there, when they realized the great storm flows from stormwater runoff was washing the salmon downstream and preventing the eggs from hatching. There's been a huge amount of research on this topic, and study after study has shown that there's a direct relationship between impervious cover and water quality. And this chart pretty much summarizes it, where if we have 10% impervious cover, our water bodies are going to be in good shape. For the most part, that's what we find in Rhode Island. In fact, at even 4% impervious cover, sensitive brook trout can be affected, and DEM has found that native brook trout only occur in watersheds with 4% or less impervious cover. When we proceed with development, the areas that are impacted in terms of water quality standards are found where the impervious cover is up to 25%. But these are still areas that can be restored in this impacted area. Once we get to the damaged area above 25%, researchers show that the only improvements can be made in flood control, not water quality. And then by the time we get to highly urban areas like 60%, those are severely damaged. They're basically channelized streams and rivers, and channelized with embankments. But even in these damaged areas, we can plant trees and restore landscaping and avoid the heat island effects that are so detrimental in urban areas. So let's take a quick look at where we stand statewide in terms of impervious cover. Scott is going to cover the urban service boundary. That's the USB on the side there. And it's also depicted by the red line, mostly around the Providence area, but with little islands elsewhere. Within the urban area, we can see the impacts of development, where on average, it's over 27%. In fact, some of the black areas are almost 100% impervious cover. And outside the urban service area, we're at 5%. And this is based on the most recent data from DEM with 2020 mapping. And so this is very encouraging that we can still protect our natural areas where many of the parks and water supplies are located. And DEM confirms the concept that these areas are impaired by their monitoring studies. So the purple areas you see are not meeting water quality standards, and in many cases, it's due to stormwater runoff. The issue is this is now a statewide problem that's affecting our cleanest resources. We know that bacteria counts cause beach closures, and those are related to storms. So it's disappointing for any family that had planned an outing for that day, but it also has serious economic consequences, since our beaches and other open spaces are one of our main economic drivers for tourism. Secondly, we're beginning to see water quality impacts in freshwaters. This is actually Nenegrit Pond, but areas and rural areas of the state where we've considered pristine and have not had problems before. In fact, there have been algae blooms on the Citrus Reservoir in the eastern end, where some of the sub-reservoirs there are more shallow and are more susceptible to nutrient enrichment. So what are the problems that municipalities face, and what are they doing about it? First, to keep in mind, most of the problems with high density often occur in areas where there are many substandard lots of record, lots that have been platted out on paper years ago. And those are almost always concentrated in the coastal pond areas where there were vacation homes, now converted to year-round use, or around freshwater lakes like Johnson's Pond, where there are tiny little houses that were originally camps, and in other areas of the state. The issue here then is trying to manage development with these small lots. The South Shore communities have been leaders in this regard because they had early concerns about 20 years ago with the decline of the quality of the coastal ponds, which are so valuable for recreation and property values. Based on studies done by URI and CRMC determined that the zoning density should be based on 2 acres, and that was based on nutrient loading studies with a clear scientific evidence. The towns, Charlestown, South Kingstown, and others, adopted those recommendations for lot size and also for septic system setbacks from shorelines. In addition to this, the towns spearheaded use of advanced treatment systems and on-site wastewater management programs run by the communities, which then began to offer community septic system loan programs. They recognized that advanced treatment systems were the only option for repairs because before then, the conventional systems took up so much space, people did not have any option but to replace their cesspools. Another example in a different part of the state and different geology is Jamestown. They have an area of small lots clustered in one area called Jamestown Shores, and they began to notice erosion problems were problematic with runoff, with development runoff and running off into others' neighboring properties. So they did a groundwater quality study, and the study showed high levels of nitrogen, which come from septic systems and fertilizers. And they identified levels that were increasing almost to the point of 10 parts per million in some lots, but generally in the 5 milligram per liter range, which is considered a red flag. If you are at a 5 milligrams per liter for groundwater nitrogen, that's a concern that it may eventually increase to 10, the drinking water standard. So based on that work, they adopted a high water table ordinance that severely restricted the percent impervious cover, so they couldn't build a McMansion on a tiny 10,000 or 5,000 square foot lot. So they reduced the impervious cover and required advanced treatment systems and required more infiltration to the extent possible. However, the result was that the increased growth, despite these measures, resulted in further growth, further addition of new housing with an increase in density overall, so that a second study showed there had been no increase in no improvement in groundwater quality in those areas. In fact, the nitrogen levels had increased since all these improvements have been made. So that underscores the need to control density because septic systems and other measures are not adequate to overcome the impacts of density. Another example is town of West Greenwich. They have bedrock groundwater wells there. And oftentimes bedrock wells do not have the same high yield that nice deep sand and aquifer wells have. And they began having problems with wells going dry with new housing and in housing developments. This was such a concern that they adopted a new regulation that required more testing when a new well was drilled to ensure safe quantity and yield. And that has solved the problem since then. And Coventry has adopted the same regulation shortly afterwards. Finally, let's go back to see what happened in the coastal ponds area where Charlestown had originally participated in the wastewater management program. And that was 20 years ago. Since then, Charlestown has developed an extremely comprehensive and advanced program, and they have actually eliminated all but 2 cesspools in the entire town, which is incredible. So they've continued groundwater monitoring to see the impact of that. And it's very discouraging, but the groundwater nitrate levels continue to increase despite all the improvements they've made. And that is based on density. There's no other explanation for it. Density with increased development on small lots, oftentimes with pretty large houses with multiple occupancy potential, and with fertilizers as well. But septic systems are definitely contributing, well, based on many studies, about 80% of the nitrogen versus about 20% for fertilizers and other sources. So with that, I'd like to turn over the slides to Scott.
Thank you, Lorraine. Apologize for the slow turnaround there. What I'd like to do is, now that Lorraine has done an excellent job of explaining the water quality problems that can occur with density, how do we avoid those problems moving forward? So the first slide you're seeing here is from the state land use plan. This is the state's vision for how Rhode Island should grow. And the state established something called the urban service boundary. That's shown in various shades of pink. And it's outlined by a dark black line. That's in the eastern part or the right-hand side of the map of Rhode Island. And that urban service boundary is that area in Rhode Island that is served by supporting infrastructure. It both has public water, it has public sewer, it has a rail corridor going through it. It can be more easily served by RIPTA bus service. Because of this supporting infrastructure, the state said we want to encourage, to the extent reasonably possible, most of Rhode Island's future growth within this urban services boundary. And this boundary is not hard and fast. So if a town wants to extend public water or public sewer outside the urban service boundary to encourage growth, they can certainly do that. But for the most part, this is the area the state wants to encourage growth. Outside the urban service boundary, that's the area to the left of this figure, and it's in various shades of green. The state is saying we want to maintain low density, but wherever possible, we want to try to use compact growth. And that's what you're seeing in these yellow stars. So towns could try to create villages that would be surrounded by protected areas of open space. So, and the reason being is outside the urban service boundary, that's where some of the state's most important natural areas are. That's where some of our best farmland, our most important forest, our best habitat, and certainly our best water quality. And what this is showing you, this is Rhode Island's drinking water supplies. Most of these are clearly located outside the urban services boundary. The blue is surface water supply watersheds. The green and purple circles are showing you wellhead protection areas. Sort of the beige color is groundwater aquifers. And in sort of the bottom left-hand corner of the state, you're seeing this large pink area. That's been designated by the EPA. That's the Wood-Pawcatuck watershed. It's been designated by EPA as a sole source aquifer, meaning that everybody living in that area, that's their only source of water is groundwater. So clearly it's very important to protect these areas. So to assist towns in finding areas that are suitable for high density residential development, statewide planning did this analysis a number of years ago, and they did a really good job. This is showing an illustrative example from the town of Coventry. What statewide planning did is they went inside the urban service boundary, and that's the right of this figure, and they determined where in Coventry could the town have suitable areas for high density residential development, and that's shown in colors of gold and red. Notice outside the urban services boundary, the state is not suggesting high density residential development, but you do see sort of a yellow star in the middle of the town. That's an area that they targeted as a potential site where the town might want to consider a village. Now, there's been a lot of confusion about minimum lot sizes, and are larger lots justified? So what this slide shows is there's a relationship between impervious cover and residential lot size. And as you can see, the bold white line in the middle of this graphic, if you have a lot size 3 acres and greater, and as your town or that particular watershed gets built out, you can stay within that 10% threshold of impervious cover that Lorraine Joubert explained was critical to try to stay below. Anything above 10%, you're going to begin to see signs of water quality contamination. As we drop down to 2 acres, as you can see, if you build out a town at 2 acres, you're above that 10% threshold. Dropping down to 1 acre, and let's be honest, I think all of us would consider 1 acre as a relatively large lot. As you can see, if you build out the town or a watershed at that density, you're going to have a 20% impervious cover, which is well above the threshold necessary to protect and maintain good, clean, safe water. So a good example of how this works, I'm using the Scituate Reservoir watershed. As most Rhode Islanders know, this provides about 60% of the state's drinking water supply. What you're seeing here in red is all the areas that are currently developed. That's the impervious cover. The areas in beige are undeveloped land. The areas in green is land that's been protected by Providence Water to protect the water quality. And there's good news and bad news on the slide. First, the good news, on average, the impervious cover throughout the watershed is approximately 4%. So we're well below that 10% threshold. And many of the streams out there would be expected to support brook trout habitat. Again, we have to stay below that 4% to maintain good aquatic habitat. The bad news on this slide is in the eastern part of the watershed, or to the right-hand side of your screen. There we're seeing much more impervious cover, and on average, that area of the watershed is at 9% impervious cover. And recent monitoring data has determined that is the area where the Scituate Reservoir is experiencing its greatest contamination sources. In fact, all contaminants tested across the board are seeing elevated levels of contamination in that area. So let's take a look at why that might be. In the western part of the watershed, where the impervious cover is 4% or below, the towns have adopted densities of approximately 3 acres and greater. In the eastern part of the watershed, that's not the case. They're well below. In many cases, they're 1 acre or less. That's why we're having water quality contamination in the eastern part of that watershed. Now let's take a look at how compact growth can help minimize impervious cover. As you're seeing in scenario A on your left, if we build out a town or we build out a watershed at 1 acre house lots, 1 unit per acre, at the site level and at the town or watershed level, you're getting a 20% impervious cover. As we stated previously, that's not desirable. That's well above the threshold we want to be of 10%. So if we take the same number of houses and we reduce the lot size to 4 units per acre, at the site level, we're above the 10% threshold at 38%, but over the watershed, we're just about at that 10% level. But as you can see, we're reducing impervious cover by almost half. Now, if we move to scenario C, at 8 units per acre, again, the same number of housing units, at the site level, you're getting a 65% impervious cover. Again, it's well above what we'd like to see, but over the watershed, we're well below that 10% threshold. But I need to stress that scenarios B and C would require public water for communities to get to that level of density. So let's take a look at some techniques to balance housing and water quality. And this is not an all-inclusive or exclusive list by any means. It's really focusing on those areas outside the urban service boundary. And it's primarily looking at techniques that can minimize impervious cover and help guide development away from sensitive water bodies and wetlands. And we have conservation development, village development, transfer of development rights. I was involved when I worked at DEM in developing model ordinances and guidance for all of those techniques. First, let's take a quick look at conservation development. And conservation development is really a form of cluster development that uses a design process to try to determine where on that parcel of land development is most suitable to minimize impacts to water quality and other important character defining features that could be on that property. And I think you can see the visual difference. On your left, you're seeing a conventional 9-lot subdivision. The lot size doesn't really matter if we build conventional cookie cutter subdivisions like the one you see on the left. You're really accelerating the destruction of really all the important natural resources that are on that site. Really, the whole site is developed. There's no preservation of open space, and water quality is going to be impacted. If we look at the conservation development, which is on your right, you're seeing the same number of houses, still seeing 9 lots, but again, you're using a more thoughtful design process to determine where that development is most appropriate. Again, it significantly reduces impervious cover. And it also helps the town preserve open space without buying it. And this is also very important for achieving our housing objectives because it can reduce construction costs by approximately 40%. And that's primarily due to shorter roads, less length of driveways. But if a developer can save 40% on construction, obviously that helps keep the cost of housing down. And because there's more land available on a conservation development, a town could provide an incentive for a density bonus to get, if it meets low and moderate income housing criteria, to help begin to build more housing in areas that already had, in this case, the supporting infrastructure. If the town chose to put a multi-family, a duplex or a multifamily, assuming that they had the capacity to do that, that would enhance this even more. Now let's take a look at village development. As I mentioned, the state really didn't want to see a sprawling development pattern like this outside the urban service boundary. What they were trying to encourage towns to do instead is to use more compact mixed use of development, such as could be seen in existing or creating a new village center. As you can see in this slide, you're actually seeing more development than you saw in the previous slide, but here you can actually have a mixture of uses. You could have residential, you can have different residential types. You might have multifamily, you could have single family, you could have commercial, you could have institutional uses. The advantage to this is you're not only reducing impervious cover, you're helping to concentrate growth in areas that are most suitable to take the development pressure off the community's farms and forests. These areas are also easier to serve with mass transportation. The last technique I want to talk about is the transfer of development rights. And as the name implies, the developer is actually purchasing development rights from a parcel of land that the town wants to protect, and they're transferring that development into an area that the town feels is more suitable to support growth. It could be apartments over existing retail. It could be additional density that the town feels, again, is appropriate within an existing or perhaps a planned new village center. When I was at DEM, we thought this technique had a lot of potential. It's been extremely successful in other parts of the country, but I have to admit it's a lot more challenging to implement. We tried to do this in the town of Exeter. We did adopt an ordinance, and we made it a little simpler. What we did is we allowed a developer to try to buy additional density in an area that would be more density than the underlying zoning district would allow. That money could be used by our local land trust to buy land elsewhere in the town. So as a trade-off for getting density in one part of the community, we were receiving funds for that extra density so we could help preserve land elsewhere in the town. So let's review some key points. Housing density needs supporting infrastructure, and in Rhode Island, we're not going to solve the housing crisis without density. The best locations for this density are within the urban service boundary, because that's the area that has the existing infrastructure. Compact growth can help avoid impacts to water quality by reducing impervious cover and helping to guide that growth away from sensitive water bodies. The towns outside the urban service boundary should maintain lower densities, but use compact growth. And last but not least, the state really needs to provide financial and technical assistance to make this work. I'm a member of a local planning board, and I can speak firsthand that using these techniques is hard. It's very difficult to balance the need for housing, water quality protection, and all the other issues that towns need to be mindful of. Towns need help. They need technical assistance. They need third-party consultants. If they're going to create a village, they would certainly need money to help support the upgrade of infrastructure to make that happen. There's a big role for the state to play to make this happen. So I'm going to stop there, and we can begin to address your questions.
Scott and Lorraine, thank you so much for that really informative presentation that you provided. As folks are getting their questions into our Q&A box, we have one more poll we'd like to post, and then we'll get, once we finish that, we'll get right to the questions and that you all have. All right. Looks like we've got a majority agreeing that directing housing and supporting infrastructure within the urban service boundaries and village centers is the best way to meet housing needs while protecting water resources. So good job, Lorraine and Scott, in making your points. Let's get right to the questions. So we have one from Taylor Ellis, who has asked, what are the assumptions associated with the impervious cover and density slide? That was fairly early on in the presentation. I think, Lorraine, that might be best directed to you.
Okay, thanks, Taylor. Is this Taylor of Taylor Ellis of West Kingston fame? Maybe he can't hear me, but if so, hello. Those studies, the early studies were most likely based on either measurements of impervious cover or assumptions based on land density, because at that time, the impervious cover mapping was not so sophisticated. But nowadays, the studies are based on GIS analysis, which is as accurate as possible. It's highly accurate and it goes down to very high resolution. So the impervious cover is calculated, and for build out analysis, the zoning standards are used to estimate how much further growth would be possible. Does that address your question?
He can't respond directly,
Right,
but
I'm
so
hoping that
yeah.
and if not, then please submit another.
Okay. In the meantime, we'll move on to the next, and that is that there was a question from William Veno. I believe Scott said clustering would require public water service. Wouldn't it also require public sewer or clustered systems?
That's a good question. Again, it depends on the density. So if you're clustering in a conservation development and you're taking, say, a 3-acre house lot, you could reduce that down to about a half an acre with on-site wells and septic systems. And that's assuming you're guiding that growth into soils that are appropriate and don't have seasonal high water tables. If you're getting to densities greater than a half an acre, then you're looking at probably you're going to need some kind of public water. As you begin to get into much higher density, say multifamily housing, a mixture of like a village kind of situation, there are scenarios where you can use packaged wastewater treatment, but then the town has to look at some kind of who's going to ensure the operation and maintenance of that. So there are some issues there, but you don't always need to have sewers.
Great, thank you for that. Another question for Scott is related to the conserved land and whether that would be owned by the town or a homeowners association.
That's a good question. In Rhode Island, the open space that would be preserved in a conservation development, there's actually 4 ownership options. The town working with the landowner can choose which one is best for them. It can be owned by the town. It can be owned by a homeowners association. It can be owned by a conservation organization whose principal purpose is land conservation, such as Audubon Nature Conservancy or a local land trust. Or in rural towns, it can be maintained by a landowner if that land is going to continue to be used for farming, forest, or habitat.
Great, thank you for that. We have one from Ann Carroll. How do you reconcile compact growth with the 2-acre minimum recommendation for on-site septic? Is the caveat that you can only to greater density if you have a sewer system, that you can only have greater density if you have a sewer system? So the question was, how do you reconcile compact growth with the 2-acre minimum recommendation for on-site septic? Does more dense housing require that you have a sewer system?
No, I don't think so. This is Lorraine. I think Scott mentioned conservation development. So even though the minimum lot size is 2 acre, if the town has conservation development, they can still maintain 2 acre density, but cluster those individual lots together on smaller lots. So it's a matter of density, not the particular lot size.
Here's one from Robert Kearns. How does Rhode Island's housing planning work? Oops, it keeps moving on me. Compared to our neighbors is basically the question. I got to find it again here. Compare and contrast on a high level to other nearby New England states like Massachusetts.
I can start that. It's, again, we're not housing experts, but Massachusetts is providing more technical and financial assistance. They've had a pretty robust infrastructure program that Rhode Island doesn't have, or we have, but we just haven't capitalized it to the extent that Mass has, where a community could get literally millions of dollars to help them put the infrastructure in place to encourage more density. And that could be anywhere from upgrading water, sewer, to putting in better sidewalks, etc. Again, Rhode Island has a little bit of money in a similar program, but nowhere near the level of funding that Massachusetts has had.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna just hop around a little bit on the questions that are coming in. We have one from CJ Donovan. Scott, could you please go over the increased density issue slide again? Town of Exeter, I believe. You explained that it's challenging. Why is that? And how successful is it around the country? Thank you.
Increased densities, does he mean, I'm assuming he means the transfer of development rights?
Tell me why is that? The increased density issue slide, again, Town of Exeter, I believe.
I think I referenced Town of Exeter has adopted transfer of development rights. That would increase density in a particular location. So I'm going to assume that's, I'll go down this road, and if it's not, we'll try to address it another way. But
Yeah.
the town did establish a village area where we were going to allow more density. We did that in conjunction with the transfer of development rights. So if a developer wanted to come in and build density there, again, they would contribute a fee commensurate with, we had a formula in the ordinance, and that money could be used by our land trust to purchase farms or forests elsewhere in the town as a trade-off for allowing density in one location of the town. That has not worked yet in the town of Exeter for a number of reasons. In part, I think the area that we targeted for additional density probably needs more work. It would need to be probably more pad ready to encourage a developer to invest there. And unfortunately, in the meantime, somebody actually one of the landowners was impatient and actually developed a portion of the site for a solar development, lowering its value for a village.
CJ, if that didn't address your question, you could put another one in the Q&A box. I'm going to move to one that was posed by Annette Bourne. As we consider the impact of sea level rise on the areas within the urban services boundary, is it possible to think that new villages supported by new infrastructure could absorb the loss of denser housing in those areas?
I think that's very site specific. Warren has been receiving a lot of publicity for moving areas from flood prone zones into higher ground, and I think that needs to be addressed at the site specific level. There are certainly parts of undeveloped, less developed communities that have commercial areas that are languishing. Maybe some of those could be considered for a zone change to more dense residential development where there's infrastructure. Hope Valley comes to mind there.
Okay. Thank you. I have two questions from Francis Topping. One is comment on cumulative impacts of denser septics. What is the highest density with no infrastructure, that is wells and septics? What research is being done?
DEM sets standards for that in their regulations. I believe it's half acre, although I'm not sure, but it's based on the effluent from each system and the dilution factor. So if the more compact the development, maybe more compact may be possible, but they have to ensure that there's surrounding open space to provide dilution. And those calculations are in the DEM OWTS regulations.
Great, thank you. Another one from Francis is, what acreage would be needed for a new village?
Again, that really depends on the size of the village. And I think when we're talking villages, where you think of a rural hamlet, it could be something the size of Scituate Village and North Scituate Village, rather, in Scituate. It could be something the size of Japatchit in Gloucester, or it could be something very small. It probably depends on the available infrastructure to support that growth. It doesn't have to be large. And I think towns can be more creative here. And the key is to try to explore those possibilities, because that compact growth helps to solve a lot of problems.
Thank you. Here's one from Frank Mand. You use the term directing to summarize the state's intent for keeping density within the urban services boundary. The state also directed communities to create cluster and similar housing, but that did not, as far as I can see, reduce density. We ended up with dense cluster areas back to back in areas that were supposed to be rural. It seems we facilitated that development rather than controlled it. Shouldn't the state require limited densities if the problem of water contamination and the like are so critical today?
That's a good question. Back in the mid 80s, actually, Lorraine and I think Elizabeth may have come in, and on the tail end of this, the governor at the time established a task force because they were very concerned about development in the Scituate Reservoir watershed. A plan was developed, and it did have very specific recommendations for maintaining low density in the watershed communities. For the most part, Scituate, Foster, and Gloucester have maintained those residential densities, and as a result, the water quality in the sections of those communities remains in pretty good shape. It's the eastern part of the watershed where towns didn't necessarily adopt recommendations for lower density, and that's where we're currently experiencing water quality problems. It's not clear if the state is going to mandate low density, although I think communities should continue to be encouraged to have low density outside the urban service boundary, and certainly not go in the other direction of mandating smaller lots in that area, which in my opinion would just accelerate impacts to water quality.
I have a question from Ann Carroll. You stated at the beginning of this presentation that state level regulations cannot solve these problems. They must be solved at the municipal level. Are there any states that provide a good model for state level regulation for these issues?
That's a good question. Again, I think the issue is state regulations, regardless of how good they are. And by the way, Rhode Island, I think Rhode Island's water quality regulations are top notch. Those regulations still can't control density. That's a municipal purview, and they can't control the type of use. For example, if somebody's going to put a high risk land use like a gas station over a groundwater aquifer, the state doesn't necessarily have the authority to say, no, you can't do that. But if in the event that gas station tank should leak and spill gasoline into the aquifer, now it becomes a major cleanup action. The state has good regulations to sort of test underground storage tanks, and they're very good, but nothing is infallible. Storage tanks can leak. So I think that's just one example. So that's why I think you need both. It can never be either or that's going to solve water quality problems.
And typically, the state agencies do a better job of controlling major sources of pollution. Once you get down to the septic system level and groundwater protection level, it's really a town responsibility, and it does take a lot of work to protect it. So, for example, North Kingstown relies on groundwater for all their public wells, and they are very active in trying to manage development to protect that groundwater, but it's more work than many smaller rural communities can handle.
Here is a question from Taylor. Gosh, it just changed on me. I wonder if Scott or someone with knowledge of the Pine View Apartments in Exeter that was just finished, where there is advanced treatment of private well water. Is this an example of meeting the needs of low-income people to live in this area and meeting environmental concerns?
Yes, I was actually a member of the Exeter Planning Board. I was involved in the review of that particular project. That's actually a comprehensive permit, and there's a Low and Moderate Income Housing Act that essentially says if towns don't meet their 10% quota of low and moderate income housing, a developer can come in, override local zoning to build density at a level that wouldn't normally be allowed. So that the town is obligated to work with that developer in order to facilitate that development. So in those situations, I think in this particular case, I think the developer was fairly cooperative. There is a good adequate water supply there, but it is a density certainly that the town wouldn't normally zone for in that particular location. It was really because it was a comprehensive permit that enabled it to get built.
Thank you. Let's see. There was a question from Anne early on about the impervious cover being disconnected impervious area, or is it total?
Well, disconnection occurs at the local level. So wherever you can, try and break up direct runoff to surface waters, and it's managed kind of on a micro scale. But the eventual result would be improvements at a larger scale if those actions are widespread enough. So it involves, low impact development type practices scattered throughout all new developments and having them maintained properly. So it's a cumulative effect to have a beneficial restoration of the water cycle, basically.
Right, and I think that most of that impervious cover, at least the calculations of percent impervious cover that we see that are based on aerial or satellite imagery, those we can't tell we're just basically looking at the impervious surface, and so we can't tell which of those are actually disconnected, meaning that they're flowing into a grassed area or otherwise not flowing directly into a surface water.
Right.
So we don't really have a way of being able to, on a broad scale,
Right.
be able to detect when it's been disconnected or not. So just
right. But the other point there is DEM standards only started requiring that in 2010 or so, and we haven't seen aggressive implementation of lid practices. There might be a small number of lid practices that handle typically a tiny fraction of the runoff, and then it gets routed to flood storage basins. So we would not expect to see a huge difference just since 2010. In fact, I think the standards would have to be improved, and that's being discussed by others in other states to improve the level of control. It's a tiny percent that is infiltrated.
Mm-hmm. We still have more questions in the chat, but we have less than 1 minute left in our webinar. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. We have we have a post-webinar evaluation that we would ask you to fill out. If you go into the chat box, you'll see the link to the SurveyMonkey, and we would ask that you would take just a few minutes to be able to fill that out and give us feedback. And I just want to thank you all for a very robust question and answer session, and to Scott and Lorraine for providing just incredibly useful information. Thank you so much, everybody.
Mm-hmm.